Herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuschauer, zu einer Folge von Gegenpol Interview. Mein Name ist Monique Stegemann und wir haben für euch mit einem besonderen Gast gesprochen. Professor Dr. Patrick Lumumba aus Kenia. Professor Lumumba ist Jurist, ehemaliger Direktor der Kenia-Rechtsschule in Nairobi und ein Experte für die innerafrikanischen Beziehungen. Als Gründer der P.L.O. Lumumba-Stiftung setzt sich Professor Lumumba für die Souveränität der afrikanischen Nationen, für den Kampf gegen Neokolonialismus und für Panafrikanismus ein. In dem vorab aufgezeichneten Interview geht es um folgende Themen. Vollendet sich durch die Militärputsche wie etwa in Mali, Burkina Faso und Niger der antikoloniale Befreiungskampf Afrikas? Wie positionieren sich die Nationen Afrikas in der zuspitzenden globalen Konfrontation zwischen NATO einerseits, Russland, China und den BRICS andererseits? Und warum blicken so viele afrikanische Nationen wohlwollend auf Russland und seine Rolle bei der Schaffung einer multipolaren Weltordnung? Unsere erste Frage an Professor Lumumba nimmt Bezug auf seinen berühmten Namensvetter, dem großen Kämpfer für die Unabhängigkeit Afrikas, Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba führte sein Land aus der belgischen Kolonialherrschaft heraus und wurde der erste Premierminister des Kongo. Seine Ermordung im Jahr 1961 unter Duldung oder sogar Mitwirkung der belgischen, britischen und US-Geheimdienste hat die afrikanische Unabhängigkeitsbewegung um Jahrzehnte zurückgeworfen. Heute erleben wir eine neue Zuspitzung der Ereignisse in Afrika. Durch eine Reihe von Militärputschen, wie etwa in Mali, Burkina Faso und Niger, wurde die postkoloniale Herrschaftsstruktur insbesondere Frankreichs zerbrochen. In den deutschen Medien werden diese Putsche als neue Entwicklung und als Abbruch einer demokratischen Entwicklung nach dem Ende des Kolonialismus interpretiert. Wir wollten von Professor Lumumba wissen, ob das tatsächlich so ist. Stellen diese Militärputsche wirklich einen Abbruch einer kontinuierlichen und demokratischen Bewegung in Westafrika dar? Oder vollendet sich mit dem Bruch zu Frankreich und dem Westen letztlich der antikoloniale Befreiungskampf der Völker Westafrikas und damit auch der Kampf Patrice Lumumbas?
Let us begin by reminding ourselves that is now settled, and you only have to read Ludo de Witt's book, that Patrice Emery Lumumba was assassinated through the complicity of Belgium and the United States of America. I think that is settled. And that was manufactured from Belgium, from Brussels, from the United States. And in fact, the code name that was given to Patrice Emery Lumumba by the Americans was Satan. That is what they called him, as Satan. And of course, we then had Kasavubu and Mobutu, whose regime was underwritten by the Americans, and he messed up Congo. And this must be understood in the context of the neo-colonial project. The Western colonizers, whether they were French or British or Spanish or Italians or the Dutch or the Belgians, never intended to leave. And it is instructive, therefore, to appreciate that what we have seen, the wave of coup d'etats we are seeing now, is in itself not new. In fact, immediately after independence, the coups that were mounted were initiated from Europe and America. The very first coups, as I've said, of Patrice Emery Lumumba, the coup against Kwame Nkrumah in 1906, and even much earlier, the assassination of Sylvanus Olympio in Togo, the coup against Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, the removal of Modibo Keita in Mali, all these were manufactured. The mutinies that took place simultaneously in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, these were manufactured as a part of the neo-colonial project. So the Western powers have never left. And the most pernicious of the colonizers is France. We will all remember that when they left during the presidency of Charles de Gaulle, they mounted a vote of yes, no, and the countries that voted no, namely Guinea-Conakry under Sékou Touré, and the French Sudan, which is now Mali under Modibo Keita, and Algeria under Ahmed Ben Bella, the French literally destroyed even sewing machines. And they entered into a pact with the other colonies to continue controlling their economies, including running their central banks, including making their currencies, including all the pernicious things that they continue to do. Therefore, when you see coup d'etats being mounted now, this is the last kick to get the French out of Africa. And whenever I hear Europe and America talk about democracy, I laugh. Whose democracy? Who defines democracy? Why must Bonn and Washington and Paris and London tell us how to govern ourselves? Did they say the same thing when Antonio de Spinola overthrew Marcelo Caetano in Portugal? Did they tell them that they were anti-democratic? These coups are the beginning of a revolution. The military people are midwifing a process because the civilian population has been so disempowered that they have nothing to do. They just pray to God. So God, in his own unfathomable ways, is now animating young people to overthrow France in Chad, and I'm using overthrow France in Burkina Faso, overthrow France in Niger, overthrow France in Guinea-Conakry, and we look to the French being overthrown, and in Gabon, we look to the French being overthrown in Cameroon. We are waiting for more coups. And we say this very seriously because this, if choreographed well, will then segue into civilian administration. And I don't want to use the word democracy. I want to use the word governance. We must govern ourselves. We must cut the umbilical cord that ties us with France, with the United Kingdom, and latter-day neo-colonizers if Africa is to be free and truly independent beyond the flag and the national anthems.
Die Militärregierungen in Mali, Burkina Faso und Niger haben radikal mit der postkolonialen Hegemonie Frankreichs gebrochen. Frankreich wurde der Zugriff auf billige Rohstoffe und die Nutzung der Länder als militärisches Aufmarschgebiet verwehrt. Und nicht nur das, die militärische Kooperation der drei Länder untereinander und ihr offener Schulterschluss mit Russland stellt die westeuropäischen und nordamerikanischen Eliten vor immense geopolitische Herausforderungen. Warum fanden diese Putsche jetzt und vor allem in den Nationen der sogenannten Francafrique statt? Welche Folgen haben die Putsche und auch die militärische Vereinigung Malis, Burkina Fasos und Nigers für das politische Gefüge innerhalb Afrikas? Könnten noch andere Länder dem Beispiel folgen?
You know, in the mind of the neo-colonizer, Africa is a theater of war and an arena for competition. That is why you hear in diplomatic speak, you hear of things such as geopolitical interest. So the Americans and the Europeans think that Africa is a playground, which they have been dominating, and now they are not dominating as they should, and they fear that there will be another dominating hegemon or hegemons in the nature of China and Russia, and that their military bases will be taken away. From where I sit, it is the same. We must not make the mistake in the continent of Africa of replacing one slave master with another. Today, we are embracing Russia and China because we have a wild cat in our house. And when you have a wild cat in your house and you have somebody who's telling you they'll help you drive them away, you allow that person to do so, but you don't necessarily make him a permanent resident in your house. So it must be understood that Africa wants to liberate itself. Why should Europe and America have bases in Africa? Will they allow Africans to have bases in London? Will they allow any African countries to have bases in Paris or in the United States of America? The truth is, in the mind, in the inner sanctums of the minds of the former colonizers and the latter-day colonizers, Africans are still to be treated like little children. That is why you have a base. That is why you have economies that are dominated and dictated to by the Bretton Woods institutions. And Africans are now saying, the younger generation of Africans are saying, enough is enough. We want to be free, and we want to be free indeed. And they have seen other countries regain independence. They have seen the Chinese asserting themselves. They have seen the Turks assert themselves. They are seeing the Indians assert themselves. They are seeing the Arabs assert themselves. And they are saying it is time for Africa to assert herself in order to repel these countries whose only claim to fame is the desire to dominate. Are we irritating the West? Yes, we are irritating them. Will they go away easily? No. And you can see it in the arrogance of the French president. The French president says, without France, there is no Niger. Without France, there is no Burkina Faso. Without France, there is no Guinea. Without France, there is no Chad. Without France, there is no La Côte d'Ivoire. Without France, there is no Benin. Without France, there is no Togo. Without France, there is no Senegal. That is arrogance in the 21st century. That is how arrogant the individual is. And the time is now to tell him his goose is cooked, because Africans have woken up, the scales have fallen off our eyes, and the wax has melted off our ears. Is not going to be easy, because it is still true that power springs from the barrel of the gun. That is the basis of European arrogance. They are arrogant because they have the nuclear bomb. That is all. Beyond that, there is no basis for arrogance. They know that, they can threaten us with fire and brimstone. But how many of us will they kill? In the billions? So the truth is that we are saying in Africa that we want to take charge of our resources. Are we isolating ourselves from the world? No. We say we want to trade with Europe. We want to trade with Germany. We want to trade with the Soviet Union. We want to trade with the United States of America, but from a standpoint of mutual respect, a symbiotic relationship, not a parasitic relationship. And that is why I hear Traore saying in Burkina Faso, you want uranium? Come and build the factory in Ouagadougou. You want to do industry? Come and do it in Niamey. You want to build an agricultural enterprise? Come and do it in Conakry. This is what I hear them say, which is reasonable.
Afrika rückt in den letzten Jahren stärker in den Fokus der globalen Auseinandersetzungen. Die Konfrontation zwischen dem Westen einerseits, Russland und China andererseits, stellt auch die afrikanischen Nationen vor schwerwiegende geopolitische Abwägungen. So zeigte der Afrika-Gipfel in St. Petersburg im Juli dieses Jahres, welchen Stellenwert Russland und Afrika füreinander haben. Welche Auswirkungen hat die globale Blockbildung für die Nationen Afrikas? Wo sind die Unterschiede im Engagement Russlands und Chinas in Afrika im Vergleich zum Westen? Und warum blicken so viele afrikanische Nationen positiv auf Russland?
Let me start with the last question. Why do we look favorably towards Russia? And when we talk Russia, we also see Russia as the immediate successor of the Soviet Union. When Africans were fighting to regain their independence, Russia or the Soviet Union was on the side of Africans. Russia has stood with Africans in the form of the Soviet Union through the difficult periods. While the European powers were dominating and discriminating against Africa, Russia was there. When the European countries were dehumanizing Africans, Russia was there. And you will remember that they even named a university after Patrice Emery Lumumba, the Patrice Emery Lumumba Friendship University in Moscow. That is why when Russia is in trouble, Africa remembers you stood with us when France was insulting us, when the British were insulting us, when the Spaniards were abusing us, when the Portuguese were abusing us, when the Italians were harassing us, when the Dutch, through their cousins in South Africa, instituted apartheid, when the Belgians were killing 13 million Congolese, you are there. And that is the reason why Russia has a place in the hearts of many patriotic Africans. But do I believe that Russia necessarily is going to be a replacement? And do we want the old European colonizers to be replaced by anybody in that capacity? No. We want to trade with Russia. We want to trade with China. We don't want them to be the new colonial masters. However, colonialism is defined. We don't want China to believe that Africa is going to be dominated. And if you look at it from that perspective, one of the things that at an individual level I hate most are these summits where 54 African leaders are summoned to St. Petersburg, where they are summoned to Beijing, they are summoned to London, they are summoned to Brussels, they are summoned to New Delhi, they are summoned to Beijing. We must have respect for ourselves. If African leaders are meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, is it not easier and cheaper for Vladimir Putin to attend the meeting? Is it not cheaper for Joe Biden to attend the meeting? It is not easier for the Prime Minister of Japan to attend the meeting or the President of China. But as I've said before, if you behave like a banana, you will be eaten by monkeys. And for a long time, African politicians behave as if they were bananas. They behave as if they are weak, and they are treated like you treat weak people. So the time is now to stop attending these meetings to which we are summoned and given fake photo opportunities and 21 gun salutes. Let us tell them, you visitors in Africa, we have 54 of us. Why do we fly 54 private jets or whatever number of jets they are? Fly one private jet is even cheaper for you and meet us on our home turf. The time is now for Africa to say with their mouths what they believe in their hearts and to demonstrate to the world that they are not to be treated like little children. I read a book as a young boy, Gulliver and the Lilliputians. And the Lilliputians were little ones and Gulliver was the giant. Africa is no longer Lilliputian or Lilliputs. So I look forward to that day when Africans will really demonstrate that we are reading from the same page, the page of unity. And lastly, you asked about geopolitics. You know, this idea that there is a unipolar world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, truly the United States of America became the hegemon. And America claims they are the leaders of the free world. Who appointed them to lead the free world? Who defines freedom? Who defines democracy? Which God gave them the right to tell us how to govern ourselves, but yet they have arrogated to themselves the monopoly of knowledge and wisdom. And my understanding is that countries should be allowed to run their affairs in the manner that is in the best interest of their people. There is no one-size-fits-all democracy. The Germans will make the claim that they are Democrats, and I do not begrudge them. They have their own system of government. The British will make the same claim. The Danes will make the same claim. But is their democracy in Denmark the same as the democracy in Germany? No, it is not. They are different, informed by history. But they don't want the conceptual West, at least those in political leadership, think that they have an obligation. In fact, not an obligation, a right to tell Africans, this is how we want you to govern yourselves. And somehow, the leaders, some of the so-called leaders who have been overthrown through military coups actually behave in that way. One of the things that annoyed me after and continues to annoy me is when the president of France, Macron, says, I talk to Bazoum, the president of Niger, every day. Can you believe it? He says so. And that I'll only listen to Bazoum, my ambassador, will only live near me when Bazoum says so. The people of Niger mean nothing. It is their acolyte, their puppet that tells them what to do. That is how arrogance has now taken root in French diplomacy. And France is a metaphor for most of Europe.
Auf ihrem Gipfeltreffen Ende August haben die BRICS mit Ägypten und Äthiopien 2 afrikanische Staaten aufgenommen. 3 der 11 Mitglieder kommen nun vom afrikanischen Kontinent. Weitere Nationen haben Interesse an einem Beitritt bekundet, wie etwa Algerien, Angola, die Komoren, die Demokratische Republik Kongo, Simbabwe oder Uganda. Gleichzeitig haben die G20 die Afrikanische Union als Mitglied aufgenommen und auch die Idee eines Sitzes im UN-Sicherheitsrat für die Afrikanische Union geistert durch die politischen Diskurse. Bedeutet das, dass Afrika global an Einfluss gewinnt? Sollten sich die afrikanischen Länder auf eine Verstärkung ihres Einflusses in traditionellen westlichen Institutionen wie Vereinte Nationen, G20 und so weiter konzentrieren oder eher auf die BRICS und die multipolare Weltordnung orientieren?
Africa should look towards Africa through African institutions. The African Union brings together 54 nations recognized as such. Africa, under the aegis of the African Union, have Africa Agenda 2063. Africa has the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Africa is divided into 8 regions. Africa is working towards unity as contemplated and articulated in 1963. A strong and coordinated Africa will relate with the rest of the world in a much more fruitful relationship. And the danger now is that Africa is going through a stage of confusion and is being confused. And this is not the first time Africa has been confused. Post-independence in Africa, we had something which was led, and I supported it in those early days, the non-aligned movement, which was articulated at that time by Jawaharlal Nehru, Kwame Nkrumah, and of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Joseph Broz Tito, and President Sukarno of Indonesia. It was non-aligned movement and positive neutrality. That was allowed to die. Today, we have the BRICS, which sees itself as a counterweight to the European-led institutions such as the European Union and the United States of America and the conceptual West generally. The leaders economically in the BRICS are without doubt China and India and Brazil. And in many ways, Africans ought to be very careful. It used to be said during the war in Troy that you do not trust the Greeks even when they bear gifts. Let us not allow ourselves and let us warn ourselves that the BRICS is capable of being a Trojan horse, which will only lead to the further domination of African countries. I would be very careful, and all African countries that are being admitted into BRICS must walk into that arena with their eyes completely open in the knowledge that China wants to dominate the world. That is the reality. China wants to dominate the world. India would also want to dominate the world. So they are not necessarily benevolent. No. So it is the duty of Africa to retreat, because the more we are distracted from strengthening the African Union and we board every other new bus in town, we forget that there is an African bus which we ought to strengthen and which we ought to use to relate with the rest of the world. And I am therefore saying there is need for care. I would prefer myself that Africa operates as one rather than cherry-picking African countries and making them join these clubs. You know, this idea that Africans are being made to jump from one grouping of nations to the other. One day you have a photo opportunity at the G7, you jump from that. The following day you have another photo opportunity at the G20, you jump into that. The following day you have another photo opportunity at the BRICS, you jump into that. We must know and learn from the old English saying that a rolling stone gathers no moss. Africa has a potential market of 1.4 billion. Let us strengthen our institutions. Let us strengthen the AU. Let us strengthen the African Development Bank. Let us strengthen the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And from that strength, in my view, we could even come up with a single African currency. I do not have a name for it, but it could be the Afro. If we have our own Afro, let India have their rupee, let the Chinese have their own yuan, let the Europeans have their own euro and the Americans have their own dollars. We will meet in the arena of trade, strong, with our currency backed with our resources and gold. It will be 1-to-1. That is the Africa that I look forward to, not this Africa that is being brought to different parties which they do not control, and they are simply being dictated to by wannabe world dominators.
Auf seinem Twitter-Account formuliert Professor Lumumba offen, dass die alten Kolonialmächte in Afrika, sprich die Briten, Deutschen, Franzosen, Belgier, Holländer, Portugiesen und Spanier, sich nicht nur entschuldigen müssen für die koloniale Ausbeutung, sondern auch Reparationen leisten müssen. Uns hat deswegen interessiert, welches Modell der Reparationszahlungen soll dabei zugrunde gelegt werden? Wem sollen die Reparationen zugutekommen und ist die Forderung nach Reparationen nur eine politische Agenda oder kann sie tatsächlich realisiert werden?
You know, first of all, let us appreciate that apologies are necessary. And I'm glad to say that quite a number of countries have come out and said what we did was intolerable, it was dehumanizing, it was unfortunate. Some of them have not. The British have not. The French have. And I think the Portuguese have, the Spaniards have not, the Vatican has, the Anglican Church has, even the institutions have, which is a good thing and a good beginning. Is it possible to compensate Africans monetarily? No. How are you going to compensate the 13 million that were murdered under King Leopold of the Belgians? You cannot. So when we talk about reparation, we are simply saying that we want something beyond the apologies. We are saying that there is need for something that is more tangible. And that's something that is more tangible. You ought not to dictate to us. When you are a thief and you are restoring the thing that you stole, you don't tell the victim of your theft, this is how we want you to deal with the resources. We are saying we have institutions. We have the African Union. And we can create organs under the African Union, a special fund, which will then be used to administer this. And we now have calculations that have been done in the trillion denominated in dollars. This can be done. And one of the first things that we can do by way of, as a sign of goodwill, is simply to say all the so-called debts owed by African countries are completely wiped off. That would be a good beginning. And once we agree that that is the case, we then ask ourselves, to the extent that is humanly possible, whatever it is, I've seen figures being bandied around, including 21 trillion. People have different calculations. And if that fund were then to be placed in a special reparation fund to be run at the African Union with representatives from all African countries before we unite, all people who are in charge of central banks in Africa would be the trustees for that fund, will then go from country to country, and we see how that money can be deployed in the health sector, in the education sector, in the infrastructure sector, and also to create sovereign funds for ensuring that future generations are immunized from the vagaries of economic turmoil. This is the kind of conversation that I would want us to see going on when we meet the European Union or the United States of America, and indeed other parties who are involved in this rape and ravishing of the continent of Africa. And I now know that many people in Africa, in both within the continent and the diaspora, are beginning to coordinate the activities with a view to having a common approach. And we hope that we'll have partners in that regard from the West.
Abschließend haben wir über die Idee des Panafrikanismus gesprochen. Über seinen Twitter-Account gratuliert Professor Lumumba zu den Unabhängigkeitstagen jeder afrikanischen Nation. Dennoch gibt die P.L.O. Lumumba-Stiftung als einer ihrer Hauptziele die Förderung der panafrikanischen Ideale, der afrikanischen Identität und Kultur an. Wir wollten wissen, wie das zusammenpasst. Welche Rolle spielen die aus der kolonialen Teilung Afrikas hervorgegangenen Nationalstaaten in der Vision des Panafrikanismus? Soll der Panafrikanismus nicht letztlich zu einer Einheit führen, den Vereinigten Staaten von Afrika?
Yes, indeed. You remember when African countries regained independence and the very first Pan-African meeting was held effectively in 1963 in the month of May, hosted by Haile Selassie. And on that day, there were two streams of Africans. There was the Casablanca group, which said independence now, led as it was by Kwame Nkrumah. There was the Monrovia group, which said, yes, we want to unite, but let's go slowly. Julius Nyerere was in that trajectory. And ultimately, the question was in Addis, should we interfere with the inherited colonial boundaries, which were drawn very arbitrarily? And in 1964 in Cairo, it was agreed that we should not interfere with those boundaries in the belief that they would become simply administrative boundaries. Do I believe that the idea of African unity is still feasible? Yes, and I borrow the words of Kwame Nkrumah, which he spoke in 1957, 6th of May, when he said the independence of Ghana meant nothing as long as the other countries were not free. He repeated it in 1950 in Accra. He repeated it in Casablanca, Morocco in 1960. He repeated it in Accra in 1965. And what he said, that we must be prepared to concede some of our sovereignty. And when we say that we cede our common sovereignty, he said, you can continue to administer yourself, but let us have one military. Let us have one currency. Let us have one unified foreign policy. Let us have one currency. And that, to me, is possible. It is not for the faint-hearted, but we can borrow from smaller models. We can have a confederacy with a center that coordinates, but we allow the units to do almost 70 to 80% of the work. But when we deal with the world, we deal with the world as one. So that if there is an African ambassador to the United Kingdom, it is one African ambassador. If there is one to the United States, then we have one. And it can be done. The United States of America that we talk about now started as 13 countries, 13 states. It is now 50 and other territories. So I think that that is good. And in answering this question, you also asked me a question that I did not answer effectively as I should, but relates to this. The military pact that we have seen with the Niger, with the Burkina Faso, with Guinea, this could be the beginning. This is how it starts. When we have the regions in the East African region, in ECOWAS, in SADC, in the Maghreb, and ultimately in the next 50 years, we will move towards this. Europe itself may know that what you now call the European Union had its embryonic status with the Steel Union in 1950s. It started in that innocuous way. And over the years, you now have a membership that is about 27 or thereabout. So we are not being romantic when we talk about Pan-Africanism, because some say, oh, this is philosophization. This is romanticization. This is not the case. We believe that it is feasible. And when some of us go out of our way to congratulate every other independent African country, our messages are normally tailored. And I am always saying, when you regained your independence, and I'm slow because I appreciate that the independence that we regained is not what we bargained for. We got the crown without the jewels. And I look forward to people working toward this African integration. It is an intergenerational thing. I'm not for one moment deluded into believing that it will happen quickly. As Mwalimu Nyerere said it in 1965, I wish we accepted what Nkrumah said. And in 1997, he actually apologized to Nkrumah by saying, had we listened to this man before African politicians got used to being called presidents, before they got used to being called ministers, before they got used to their national anthems, before they got used to 21 gun salutes, it would have been very easy. Now we have so many of them, 55 of them or 54 of them, who fear losing the title president, who fear coming under a larger thing. So the task of African unity is a lot more difficult now because of vested interest. But if it is not difficult, it is not worth fighting for. So it is a luta continua, Victoria Arstetta, until victory is achieved.
Liebe Zuschauer, wir sagen herzlichen Dank an Professor Lumumba für seine Zeit und seine spannenden Einblicke. Und wir sagen auch an euch vielen Dank fürs Zuschauen. Wenn euch die Sendung gefallen hat, teilt unser Video breit in den sozialen Medien und abonniert unseren Kanal Gegenpol. Wenn ihr Anregungen, Kritik oder vielleicht Ideen für weitere Interviewpartner habt, dann schreibt sie uns in die Kommentare. Wir freuen uns auf eure Rückmeldungen. Ich sage Tschüss und bis hoffentlich bald auf unserem Kanal. Eure Monique.